The morning started like any other. I was up before the sun, barefoot in our kitchen, the quiet hum of the fridge and the soft burble of the coffee maker filling the silence. I wrapped my sweater tighter, watching the steam rise from the mug in my hands. The stillness was comforting. Mornings were mine, before the world stirred, before people needed things from me. I paid the water bill, glanced at the grocery list taped to the fridge. Chicken, spinach, toothpaste. The little things that kept a house together, unnoticed. I've always been the one holding the seams. Quietly. No applause. But last night, something felt off. Jonathan didn't say much over dinner. He claimed he had work on his mind, but his eyes darted away every time I spoke. No kiss goodnight. And this morning, his laptop was left open on the kitchen table. He never leaves it open. Never. I didn't go looking. I swear I didn't. But when a screen lights up in the dark, it's hard not to look. And there it was. $48 million. Wired. My breath stalled in my chest. For a second, I thought it was a project transfer. His company dealt in big numbers, developments, permits, venture capital. But this wasn't to a holding firm or a bank in Zurich. It was personal. And the name? My sister. Not a trust. Not a company name. Her name. I stood there, staring at that screen, trying to make sense of it. I ran through explanations, excuses, anything to make it make sense. Maybe she invested in something, maybe they partnered in a project? But no. Jonathan never trusted her judgment, not with anything larger than picking out throw pillows. Then came the real question. Why hadn't anyone told me? The room spun, not dramatically, but like I was on the edge of something I hadn't been meant to see. I closed the laptop, set it down gently like it might explode, and took a slow breath. I didn't yell. Didn't cry. I just filed it away. Like I always do. Around noon, I packed a small container of leftovers, lasagna from 2 nights ago, and drove to Jonathan's office. I told myself it was a kind gesture, a check-in. But I wasn't there to feed him. I needed to see. I walked through the front door with a smile. The receptionist barely made eye contact. She used to be chatty. His assistant's desk was neat, except for a yellow post-it note. Scribbled initials, my sister's. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I leaned over the trash bin near the copier, 3 freshly shredded stacks of paper. A few edges stuck out just enough. Family trust. Another said estate revisions. I didn't touch anything. I didn't have to. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan. That evening, she came. No warning, just a knock and a bottle of wine. I was in the neighborhood, she said, smiling too wide. She used to knock like that when we were kids, after stealing from my drawer. That same guilty lilt in her voice, like daring me to call her out. We sat in the living room. She made vague comments about freedom and life finally turning around. Said things like, "Isn't it funny how timing works, and some people are just meant to win?" I smiled. I poured the wine. I asked no questions. But in my head, I was listing every time she'd taken from me, every childhood birthday she hijacked, every time she cried her way out of consequences. She always landed on her feet, and I was always the floor she pushed off from. This wasn't sudden. This was calculated. It had been happening in whispers and winks, in dinners I wasn't invited to, in emails I never saw. After she left, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the office, the quiet kind that hums with betrayal. I stared at the drawer I hadn't opened in years. Inside was my father's legal pad, his handwriting faint, pages dog-eared from decades ago. I pulled it out. Not to cry. Not to mourn. To list questions. To start my own investigation. Because if they thought I was too soft, too oblivious to notice, then they'd forgotten where I came from. I waited until the house went still. Jonathan was snoring lightly, his breathing steady beside me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded down the hallway barefoot. The study smelled like old paper and dust, like secrets never meant to surface. I opened the drawer again, same one I had left ajar the night before, and this time I dug deeper. The bottom was a mess of shredded paper strips, crimped and curled, the remains of whatever they didn't want me to find. But tucked in the very back, beneath the scraps, something whole. Folded twice. No envelope. Handwritten in dark ink. I picked it up and the scent hit me before the words did. My mother's perfume, light jasmine. She'd worn it for years, even when she was too sick to leave the house. I unfolded the note slowly. Check the deposit, not the deed. That was it. No signature. No explanation. But I knew that handwriting. And it wasn't recent. Someone wanted me to see this. Someone planned for this to survive the shredder. I snapped a photo of the note, locked it in a secure folder on my phone, and slid the paper into my pocket. By morning, the sky was overcast. I told Jonathan I had errands and left before he could ask questions. The bank sat 2 towns over, still carrying the family name and its records after all these years. I hadn't been inside in over a decade. Updating contact info, I told the teller, an older gentleman with careful hands and a name tag that read Walt. He looked at my driver's license, hesitated. "You're Mr. Goss's daughter?" "Yes," I replied. He didn't smile. He tapped a few keys, then looked up again, voice lower. "Your sister was here last week. Closed the legacy account." I kept my face still. Was she? I thought that account was frozen. He paused, as if weighing how much he was allowed to say. It was. Then it wasn't. I asked for a statement. He shook his head, apologetic. "I'm afraid access was restricted. Court orders." I thanked him. Calm. Polite. Nodded like it was all perfectly fine. Walked out of the bank with my head high and my gut twisting. Control is a performance. Keep your voice steady, they don't know what you know. As I stepped outside, a voice called softly behind me. "Cressida?" I turned to see Mr. Holloway, my father's former accountant. Thinner now. Slower. But his eyes still sharp. "Your mother," he began. "She was a kind woman. I'm sorry for your loss." I nodded, too touched to reply. He reached into his coat and handed me a sealed envelope. "Your father kept meticulous records. Thought you might want this." Inside was a photocopy of a ledger page. His handwriting again, methodical, unmistakable. Line item, $48 million. Trust adjustment, beneficiary B.Goss. 3 months ago. I stood there on the sidewalk, the cold biting through my sleeves, the dots finally connecting. They didn't just steal from me. They repurposed my future. Used it to build their own. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer. They built their empire with my inheritance. I drove a few blocks and pulled into a quiet diner. Ordered black coffee. Sat in the back booth, away from the windows. Pulled out a clean page in my notebook. Drew 2 lines down the center. Wrote facts on one side. Names on the other. Walt. Mr. Holloway. Jonathan's assistant. Belinda. I listed timestamps. Amounts. Quotes. My mother's perfume. My father's note. Every detail mattered now. Then, I started emailing copies of every photo and document to a private email I rarely used. Just in case. Never fight fire with fire, my father used to say. Fight with receipts. The waitress refilled my coffee. I thanked her and smiled. She didn't see the storm behind my eyes. That night, just after I sat down with a bowl of soup, my phone rang. Blocked number. I answered. Hello? Belinda's voice, silky smooth but taut. You've been snooping again, haven't you? I let the silence stretch. Funny you called. I was just reviewing our family's legacy. There was a pause. A breath. Then her tone sharpened. Stay out of this, Cressida. You're not part of that world anymore. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I ended the call and sat quietly, the room feeling colder than it had all day. She was nervous. That much was clear. And nervous people make mistakes. I walked back to the study, sat down at the desk, opened the notepad again. Circled the words I'd read a dozen times already, checked the deposit, not the deed. And this time, I finally started to understand. By sunrise, my kitchen looked like a war room. I spread every document across the island, ledgers, estate files, trust papers my mother had tucked away before she died. The photocopy from Mr. Holloway lay in the center, lit by the pale light coming through the blinds. The numbers didn't line up. Not even close. The $48 million wasn't from one account. It was siphoned from at least 4, all dormant trusts tied to my name years ago. My name. Quietly removed, line by line. Every folder Jonathan shredded made sense now. He hadn't been cleaning up. He was erasing a trail. A patient crime, one piece of paper at a time. I traced one account number with my finger, whispering to the empty room, it wasn't one theft, it was a dismantling. I remembered something my father once said, sometimes, theft doesn't break in, it moves in and changes the locks. That thought sat heavy in my chest. I'd lived beside my own betrayers and set the table for them each night. Still, I wasn't ready to confront anyone. Not yet. Facts first. Emotion later. I called the estate attorney's office mid-morning, pretending to ask about routine inheritance procedures. The receptionist transferred me to a young clerk, new voice, nervous. I asked if the Goss family trust was still active. There was a pause. Papers shuffled in the background. Well, Mrs. Barrett, the clerk said cautiously, according to our records, your revocation form was processed in June. Everything transferred under authorization. My what? Your revocation form. With your signature. I can forward a copy if you'd like. Please do, I said calmly. My voice didn't even shake. When the email came through, I opened the PDF and stared. My name signed in perfect loops, the way I used to sign before I stopped using my maiden initials. Same pressure, same slant. A forgery clean enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. They'd studied me. My habits, my handwriting, my trust. Jonathan and Belinda. It had their fingerprints all over it. I didn't call them. I didn't even allow myself anger. I saved the document, printed 2 copies, and slipped them into a brown envelope marked evidence. I needed proof that could speak louder than my voice ever could. By noon, I was at the cemetery. Both my parents were buried there under a tall oak. I parked near the fence and walked the narrow path between the stones. The air was cold enough to sting. I stood at my mother's grave and let the quiet do its work. She'd warned me once, half a year before she passed, in a whisper between her pills and the hum of the oxygen tank. "Your sister's not evil," she said softly. "She's just tired of pretending you don't matter." Back then, I'd brushed it off as delirium. But now, those words had a different weight. My whole life I'd let small cuts slide. Jokes at my expense. Decisions made without me. Every small betrayal was just practice for this. At my father's stone, I knelt down, pressing my palm to the cold marble. "You taught me to document everything," I said quietly. "I wish I'd started sooner." After a while, I stood and brushed the dirt from my knees. There was still daylight left, and questions to chase. I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk behind the counter didn't ask why I wanted copies of the family trust deeds, she just printed what I requested. As I sorted through the pages, one detail froze me. 2 properties, one in Fairfax, another in Loudoun, sold off within the last 6 months. I hadn't even known we owned them. I flipped to the notarization line. Claire Henderson. I hadn't seen that name in years. She used to come to family dinners, sit next to my mother, laugh too loud at Belinda's jokes. Then one day she stopped showing up. My mother once said she and Belinda had words. Claire had notarized the fake deeds. That meant she knew something, or had been used to. Either way, she was a thread I needed to pull. I snapped photos of every page, filed them under property fraud, and before leaving, searched her name on my phone. One old address popped up, an apartment complex 2 towns away. By the time I got home, the light outside had dimmed to orange. I was tired, hollow, but my mind wouldn't rest. I walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon polish, and pulled out my mother's old cookbook. As I flipped through the pages, a small folded note slipped out and landed on the counter. Different paper. Older ink. My mother's handwriting again. If they're shredding paper, they're hiding proof. Trust your instincts, Cress. I stood there for a long time, holding that note. It wasn't part of the others, it had been hidden years earlier. A quiet act of warning from a dying woman who'd seen too much. She'd known. All along. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone. Searched Claire's number again. Dialed. 1 ring. 2. Then, someone answered. "Hello?" The voice wasn't hers. But it knew my name. I pulled into Belinda's new townhouse just after 5. The sky was still holding on to light, but barely. The place looked polished, glossy, like it had something to prove. I'd seen these walls before, helped her pick the cabinet finishes 2 years ago when she was just browsing ideas. Now it stood complete, like it always belonged to her. She greeted me with a hug too long, too rehearsed. "To a new chapter," she said, lifting her glass. I clinked mine out of habit. "To bigger things," I replied. But I knew right then, we were reading from different books. Her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Around the room, guests, lawyers, developers, mutual acquaintances who used to ask me about Belinda, now avoided my gaze or offered forced nods. I wasn't at the table. I was being displayed. She spoke again, eyes twinkling like she'd won something. Hard work pays off, huh, Cressida? Just like we used to dream. I nodded, and in my head I said, you dreamed of taking. I dreamed of building. Everything about the room was cold precision. I watched her move, her laugh, her cadence, the way she held court. It wasn't envy. It was the realization that I had mistaken proximity for inclusion. Later that night, back home, I sat in the den with Dad's old legal pad opened. The same one I hadn't touched in years. My pen hovered over the page as I replayed Belinda's toast. Just like we dreamed. My jaw tightened. I flipped back a few pages and found his old margin notes. One scribble, faint and underlined twice, D equals Cressida. It sat beside a property ID, the same one listed as sold last week. That house wasn't just a number. It was an inheritance. I had always been D. I just didn't know they reassigned the alphabet while I was looking the other way. The toast, the sale, the missing files, it all started to click. And I stopped feeling surprised. I wasn't forgotten. I was systematically removed. My pen finally touched the page. Who authorized asset shift? What date was D equals removed? Who replaced me? I stared at the list, felt heat rising in my chest, but it wasn't panic. It was focus. The kind that quiets a room. The next morning, I walked into the same law firm where the junior clerk had once slipped up. She met me in the small conference room with coffee already poured, like we were about to chat weather. I placed the photocopied ledger under my mug and waited. She glanced down, recognized it, but didn't say a word. I'd like to review all revocation forms filed last year, I said, calm and clipped. Her smile faltered. We had some admin errors last quarter. Some things were digitized without. Errors don't carry my handwriting. Her mouth opened, then closed. She nodded and disappeared for 10 minutes. Came back with a manila folder, too thin for what it should hold. Inside were 3 documents. One had my name in my hand. Or what they thought passed for it. Same strokes, same flow, same telltale loop in the R. But it wasn't me. I didn't argue. I scanned it silently, slipped it into my folder. Let her breathe. Walking out, I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. They were banking on silence. But I had a ledger. I had notes. And I had patience. By evening, I sat at my kitchen counter drafting an email. Short. Clinical. Sent to 2 people, Jonathan and Belinda. Subject, adjustments. Body, I know the ledger doesn't lie. Attached is Dad's note. You remember him, he taught us to keep records. Looks like he kept one more than you thought. I attached the scanned page. Trust adjustment, beneficiary B.Gos. Plain as day. Not 2 minutes passed before Jonathan called. His voice was smooth. Too smooth. Cress, put that away. This isn't your business anymore. I took a breath. Not deep. Not dramatic. You're right, I said. It's not mine. But you don't get to keep what's stolen just because the paperwork's neat. Then I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I opened another tab, submitted a request for an independent forensic review of the signatures. A quiet move, but permanent. Before closing my laptop, I opened my journal and wrote. Courage isn't shouting. It's turning the key without a sound. I stared at the screen, finger resting over send on another draft, this one a public records notice request. And I smiled. The cursor blinked on the screen, a small, pulsing reminder that there was no turning back. I stared at the email I'd just sent to Ethan and Belinda, the proof attached like a loaded gun. I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, there was only stillness. The kind that comes right before thunder. I leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting toward the living room window. The night outside looked exactly like the one my mother died under, quiet, merciless, hiding more than it showed. She used to speak in riddles those last few weeks. Listen to what isn't being said, she'd whisper when I tried to fill the silence. Back then, I thought it was grief talking. Now, I knew better. Silence had always been her language of warning. I remembered a night years ago, Ethan came home late, smelling faintly of Belinda's perfume. He said he'd been at a family meeting. I'd believed him. Because believing him was easier than questioning him. My journal lay open on the kitchen counter. I picked up a pen and wrote slowly. Silence wasn't grace. It was fear in disguise. I flipped through old messages, Belinda's cheerful check-ins, Ethan's short replies. Lines that once read like family now read like code. Every "don't worry, I'll handle it" was a brick in the wall they built between me and the truth. The phone buzzed, jerking me out of the thought. Unknown number. Mrs. Barrett? This is Dr. Lewis, the forensic document analyst. You asked for verification of the signature? Yes, I said, sitting up straighter. He cleared his throat. It's forged. The signature on the revocation form was digitally lifted from your 2011 tax filing. My heart didn't race. It stopped, then started again slower. That document had only been stored in one place, our home safe. Only one other person had the code. Ethan. The betrayal wasn't the forgery itself. It was the intimacy of it. The theft of something private, domestic, familiar. I thanked Dr. Lewis, hung up, and reached for my red pen. Wrote a single name in the center of a blank page. Ethan. Then below it, a list, dates, documents, accounts. Every piece of paper I'd ever signed that he could have copied. I was building my own map now. One that led back to them. The next morning, I met with an old classmate, Laura, now an independent legal consultant. She owed me a favor from the days I tutored her through contract law. We met at a small office above a coffee shop. No plaques, no logos, perfect. I slid the documents across the table. They used my signature. They transferred trust assets. And they think I'll let it go. She studied the papers, quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You don't need a courtroom. You need leverage." Her words landed like a strike of clarity. Together we drafted a temporary freeze request, targeting all trust-linked assets pending investigation. Laura traced her finger across the documents as she explained how to file it anonymously. By the time they realize what's happening, they'll be locked out of their own accounts, she said softly. That should have felt like victory. But all I could think about was how long I'd ignored what was right in front of me. I kept choosing peace, I said, almost to myself. Peace never chose me. Then stop mistaking quiet for peace, she replied. Use it as your weapon. When I got home that night, I poured a glass of water and sat on the floor with my mother's old phone. It hadn't been powered on in years. I plugged it in, waited. When the screen finally lit up, I went straight to the voicemail archive. Her voice, soft, patient, recorded long before everything fell apart. Belinda thinks she's owed. Ethan thinks she's brilliant. Don't confuse cleverness for integrity, sweetheart. That word, owed, kept echoing. It explained everything. Belinda had always believed I'd had more. More attention, more love, more credit. She wanted to even the score, and Ethan handed her the pen. I remembered a Christmas long ago, when Mom gave me a piano. Belinda had stood beside it, smiling, silent. I thought it was support. It was calculation. Family wasn't our bond, it was the currency she spent. By the time the clock hit 9, my mind was already made up. I called them both. Dinner tomorrow, I said evenly. No lawyers yet. Just us. Ethan hesitated. Belinda's voice came through faintly on speaker. About time, she said, all confidence and poison. The next evening, they arrived together. Matching calm, matching smiles. They sat at my table like guests pretending to be hosts. I placed 3 things in front of them, the forensic report, the freeze draft, and my mother's handwritten note. This ends tonight, I said. My tone was flat, deliberate. You can walk out with your dignity, or I make this public. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. Don't lie. You're not good at it. He blinked, unsure. Belinda reached for the papers, her fingers trembling just slightly before she composed herself. You wouldn't dare ruin the family name, she said coldly. I leaned forward, holding her gaze. Sweetheart, I said quietly, I am the name. For a moment, no one moved. The room hummed with the sound of their own fear. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I simply stood, gathered the papers, and walked toward the door. That night, I sent the freeze request. Watched the confirmation light up the screen. And for the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like strategy. I walked into the legal aid's office just before 8 that morning, the blazer on my shoulders still warm from last night's dinner. The receptionist glanced at me, offered a half smile, and handed me a coffee without asking. I took it, nodded, settled myself at a small table in the corner. The envelope sat on the aid's desk, confidential, trust audit. My fingers itched around it, but I let her open it. She revealed a USB stick marked M. Archive. My father's voice, locked away for years. And a document dated 2 weeks ago, titled Asset Freeze Directive, Consent, D.Voigt. I flicked through it in my mind. That voice. Darian's. On my wedding video. Hearing it here made something inside me shudder. No more waiting. This was the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. I packed up the material, ignored the butterflies in my stomach, and walked into battle. By 9:30 I entered the glass-walled conference suite at the firm headquarters, accompanied by my attorney friend and the aide. Belinda and Darian sat across the table, polished. Their confidence visible, rehearsed. I set the USB next to a heavy folder of forged revocation papers. I glanced at them and said, I'm here to show you what was hidden. You have 1 hour to choose your truth. Belinda's smirk flickered. Darian leaned back, one hand brushing his tie. The air felt thick. I could almost hear the staffers holding their breath. My words landed like stones, slow but heavy, forgery. Transfer. Silence. They shifted uncomfortably. I didn't flinch. When I presented the audit findings, the full weight of it hit the room. 2 properties sold off without my knowledge. Funds diverted offshore. All under the umbrella corporation they built themselves. I watched Belinda's face twitch when I mentioned trust adjustment, beneficiary B.Goss. Darian's calm cracked, just a bead of sweat near his temple betrayed him. I quoted my father's old warning, if they're shredding paper, they're hiding proof. And then I said, quietly but clearly, I found the proof. My voice echoed. The room shifted, staffers looked away. I felt the change. I was no longer the soft sibling, I was the storm. I offered them the choice, restore the assets now and sign a release, or face public disclosure. Darian slid a proposed settlement across to me, less than half the amount taken. I paused, letting the quiet draw their attention. My anger tightened into clarity. I filtered out the tremor of frustration and stood firm. I demanded my father's last year's financials, still missing. The assistant swallowed, handed me a shaking hand file. I wrote in my journal later, you built your mountain on sand I helped dig. And I quoted Maya Angelou in my mind, we may encounter many defeats but we must not be defeated. Belinda reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope stamped counterproof, top secret. She looked at me, eyes narrowing. And I smiled. The headphones felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the weight of everything I was about to say. The red on-air light glowed above me like a warning. The podcast title blinked on screen, The Shredded Daughter. I came up with that name 3 years ago. Back then, I wasn't brave enough to use it. But today wasn't about bravery. It was about clarity. I opened with a story I hadn't told anyone before. I was 10, maybe 11. My father handed me a ledger and said, write down what matters. If it's not in ink, it's just noise. That memory bled into the story of the forged documents, the signatures, the freeze request. My voice didn't shake. What happens, I asked aloud, when the people who teach you about family decide you're no longer part of it? There was no dramatic music. Just me, alone with a microphone, holding the truth like a loaded weapon. The stream went live. Comments started rolling in, fast. Some were kind, some angry, some clearly from bots trying to discredit me. I didn't flinch. I uploaded the evidence one by one. Scanned documents, financial routing, side-by-side signatures. I spoke about the forensic analysis, the missing assets, the stolen trust. Behind the glass of the studio window, I caught movement. Belinda. Her reflection, standing just out of reach but fully visible. I didn't stop talking. If she wanted to hear it all firsthand, good. I wasn't hiding anymore. Someone typed, "You are not invisible anymore." That one got to me. I paused, took a breath, and said, this isn't about vengeance. It's about visibility. After the broadcast, I barely had time to pull the headphones off before my inbox pinged. Subject line, comply or expose. The sender? A mid-level staffer from the firm's back office. I set up a remote board call that same afternoon. Darian and Belinda showed up like they always did, suited, smug, rehearsed. I didn't match their tone. I kept it clipped, legal. Who authorized the sale of the 2 properties under the trust? Who altered the beneficiary assignments my father signed in 2011? They danced around answers like it was theater. But I watched for the realities, Belinda's shifting eyes, Darian's long pauses, the way one board member kept glancing off screen like waiting for a cue. I documented everything. And then, I turned it up. This isn't about miscommunication, I said. It's about misappropriation. I could see them shift. That's when I quoted Oprah, turn your wounds into wisdom. I meant every word. I saved the hardest hit for last. I have a signed affidavit from Claire. She notarized your documents, but she's ready to testify about what she really saw. That name landed like a slap. Darian's pen tapped against the glass table. Belinda froze for just a second. I gave them 72 hours. Restore every asset, open the books, or the next voice they hear would be mine, under oath, in court, on the record. Silence followed. But it wasn't mine this time. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Belinda. We need to talk. Now. The lobby was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was just me. My heels echoed on the marble as I crossed through, escorted by a junior associate who wouldn't meet my eyes. The receptionist looked up, startled. I didn't slow down. 2 security guards stepped into my path but froze when they saw the motion paperwork. Public. Active. Enforceable. They stepped aside. In my bag, I had the USB, the audit files, and my father's final handwritten note, the kind of evidence no one could shrug off. I paused outside the boardroom door. My pulse matched the echo of a quote I read somewhere years ago, "Justice delayed is justice denied." I pushed the door open and stepped into the room where Belinda and Darian waited under the same overhead lights they used to weaponize against me. This time, the power didn't belong to them. I set the documents down with precision. No drama. Just facts. I asked for silence, then hit play. My father's voice, clear, steady, filled the room. This trust belongs to the rightful voice. Not the loudest one. The one that listens. Belinda's face flushed, her knuckles whitening around the chair's arms. Darian didn't blink, but I saw the tick in his jaw. The room went still. I lined up the forged revocation. The full audit. The ledgers, annotated. I looked each board member in the eye. You counted on my silence, I said. You assumed grief would keep me numb. You built this on the lie that I would never notice. I did. I turned to Belinda, slow and direct. You have one chance to undo this, before I take it to every ear that's been kept out of the room. Someone at the far end whispered something. Another glanced at their phone. For the first time, the boardroom wasn't theirs. It was fractured, divided. And I was no longer the outsider. By early afternoon, the press room was packed. Cameras, lights, clipped voices echoing from wall to wall. I stood at the podium, chest tight but head clear. This isn't about inheritance, I said. This is about erasure. About what it costs women to wait their turn. About what happens when they stop waiting. I laid out the documentation. Every transfer, every deception. The freeze motion was now part of the public record. Belinda stepped forward behind me, scripted, defensive. This family has always valued truth and legacy, she began, but her voice wavered halfway through. She knew this moment wasn't hers. Flashbulbs sparked. A question from the crowd, why now? I answered it calmly, because the truth didn't change. I did. By the time I left the building, 2 hashtags were already trending. Shredded files revealed. Not invisible anymore. That evening, the house was quiet again. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my dad's old legal pad. The lines were worn, the ink faded, but the intent was still alive. I recorded a voicemail. Not for me. For her. Thank you for trusting me, I said, and hit send to Belinda's number. I looked across the room at the small frame I'd hung the week before. Inside it, shredded strips of the first forged document I'd uncovered. A reminder. A warning. A symbol of what can be rebuilt when the lies fall apart. The TV flickered in the background. News anchors were reporting a full regulatory review into Belinda's firm. Darian had submitted his resignation, effective immediately. Just as I turned to shut it off, a message came through. It's not over until the legacy is restored. I stared at the words, then whispered to no one, then let's finish it right. The news hadn't stopped. My name danced across headlines, talk shows, phone screens. But I didn't want noise. I wanted stillness. That morning, I stepped into the woods behind the house, not to get away, but to walk into something I hadn't made space for in a long time, my own breath. No suit. No bag. Just the air, sharp and steady, like the first truth after a long lie. I paused at the big oak, the one Dad used to sit under with a book and thermos. I pulled his old pocket watch from my coat and placed it at the base. Not buried. Just left. Like a note between us. Closure, my therapist had once said, isn't an apology. It's a boundary. I understood that now. I didn't need their confession. I didn't need the money. I just needed to know I had survived what tried to erase me. I whispered, I didn't win. But I walked away whole. That's enough. Back inside, I opened the last box from the storage unit. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Inside, letters, cards, a dried boutonniere from our wedding. And then, a photo. The three of us. My younger self smiling between Belinda and my ex-husband, their hands overlapping behind my back like a silent joke I never got. I sat with it for a long time. Not sad. Just done. Then I stood, fed it into the fireplace, and watched it curl and disappear. Not out of rage. Out of release. I forgive myself first, I said quietly. I picked up a book from the shelf, opened to a dog-eared page, and read aloud, You wanna fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down. Toni Morrison. Always knew. That afternoon, I sat down with a notebook, not to document the case, not for court, just for me. A story. Maybe it would become a memoir. Maybe just a letter I'd never send. Either way, it was mine. Not reactive. Not bitter. Just honest. The next day, I drove out to the cemetery. The fall breeze played with the edge of the sunflower bouquet on the passenger seat. I laid it on my mother's grave. You believed me. Even when you couldn't speak anymore, I felt it. Then I sat by my father's stone. Read him everything. Every page of the notebook, every line I'd written. Told him what his note did, not just for the case, but for me. It reminded me that I mattered. Even when others pretended I didn't. Before leaving, I tucked a laminated copy of his note against the base of the headstone. It wouldn't last forever, but it didn't have to. Just long enough to be seen. A man with a rake approached quietly. You're the one from the TV, he said. I nodded. He said, my wife watched your press conference. She finally told her brother to back off. Said your story gave her the guts. I didn't say much back. Just smiled. Sometimes, legacy isn't a nameplate. It's the whisper that lets someone else say me too. That night, while I was brushing my teeth, my daughter came into the room holding a small folded paper. She crawled into my bed without a word, slipped the letter into my hand. Can I be the kind of woman you are someday? She asked, voice barely above a breath. My chest ached. In the good way. The kind you feel when something sacred cracks open. You already are, I said. You asked the question. I reached for the old court papers, the freeze orders, the depositions. Folded them into a single envelope and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Then I turned the key. Not to hide them. Just to end their chapter. The world kept calling it victory. But that wasn't the word I'd use. They may have shredded the files, I whispered as I switched off the light. But I rewrote the story. From the dark, my daughter asked, "Can I read your letter to Grandma someday?" I didn't answer right away. But I knew the answer was yes.